Welcome everyone again. I'm very happy to be here and as a part of this course. A little introduction about myself. I'm currently transitioning from one institution to another. For the past 3 years, I've been a senior lecturer of African Studies at the University of Environment and Sustainable Development in the eastern region of Ghana, in a town called Somanya. Um, there I teach courses on African studies that are a compulsory part of education for students at the university, irregardless of their discipline. Prior to that, I was an associate professor of African and African American studies at Grand Valley State University in West Michigan, in a town called Grand Rapids, city of about 1 million. I was there for about 10 years, where I also served at one point as the coordinator of the African and African American Studies program. My training from tertiary through master's as well as PhD are all in history. I attended a historically Black college for men, Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, and I earned my master's degree and PhD from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, where I studied under the tutelage of the West African historian Mamadou Diouf. I've served as the editor, as an associate executive editor for the Journal of Pan African Studies. I'm currently in the process of co-founding a new journal, open access journal here in Ghana, called the African Journal of Media and Society. And in addition to my first publication, book publication, as well as articles, I'm currently writing a book that explores the relationship between African-centered scholarship and scholars, particularly Black scholars, and the issue of repatriation or returning to the African continent. So I like to, and I hope my screen is being seen by you, because for some reason I can't see you, but can you see my full screen and see me?
Yeah, we can.
Great. First, I'd like to start. Does anybody recognize, I'm trying to see where I can see you all too. Does anybody recognize any of the images that they see here on this first slide? Does anything look familiar? I'm just trying to get a sense of where you are.
Yeah, the left one is from Egypt. There's hieroglyph, there's miniature up top, and
Yes.
the Pan-African flag on the right corner.
Very good. Um, Anyone else? Okay, so we'll get a chance to talk about these images. We'll talk about the one in the lower right hand, the UNIA-ACL flag that was inaugurated under the leadership of Marcus Garvey in the coming week. But the others we'll talk about a bit as we move forward today. So first, I'd like to say that we'll be looking at Pan-Africanism prior to the Pan-African Conference in 1900. We'll spend a bit of time talking about that conference, however. But the main objective is to examine debates about the origins of Pan-Africanism and to interrogate different definitions of Pan-Africanism, particularly by looking at Pan-Africanism from an epistemological standpoint or from a theory of knowledge, particularly as articulated by those who operate from Eurocentric as well as Afrocentric standpoints. And this will help us understand the ongoing debates today about the emergence and character of Pan-Africanism. We'll be exploring some critical questions in this discussion today. First, we'll discuss, did Pan-Africanism begin in the African diaspora as most people understand it? Was it simply a response to slavery, racialized labor in particular? Or did it emerge as an indigenous continental African act of unity? as a response to foreign invasions from Eurasia, or what some people call Europe and Asia, well before the emergence of the Atlantic world system that emerged in the 15th century. And so at the end of this lecture, the ideal is that you'll be able to more fully understand and analyze the competing debates that you will encounter about pre-20th century Pan-Africanism, as well as identify some of the commonalities and unifying principles that underlie, as well as the differences that exist between what most scholars understand as the variety or diversity of early Pan-African ideologies and activism. So we have 5 learning objectives. Those learning objectives include having a fuller understanding of the history of Pan-Africanism, as well as taking an African-centered approach to understanding Pan-Africanism. So we'll be thinking about what Pan-Africanists have actually thought about themselves and the larger world, as opposed to what others have articulated about them. We'll look at a wide range of definitions of Pan-Africanism in this presentation, and we'll quickly notice the multiple perspectives on debates about the origins and character of early Pan-Africanism, or Pan-Africanism before the term was coined by the likes of Henry Sylvester Williams. And then we'll think about the environmental, political, security, social, cultural, and economic factors that shape Pan-Africanism. So a good way to think about this lecture is to think about it from a thematic approach. One of our themes looks at the roots of Pan-Africanism. Is it from the continent or from outside of the continent, in other words? We'll also think about this issue of epistemology again, Eurocentric and Afrocentric approaches to Pan-Africanism, before finally exploring at the end what we consider to be the contemporary relevance of early Pan-Africanism. So here are just some images to keep in mind. As was correctly pointed out, the one on the left is an image from ancient Kemet, or the land of the Black people, also known as Egypt to most audiences. This is an image that depicts the expulsion of the Hyksos around 1521 by the Per-Ah, or what people refer to as the Pharaoh, Amos. And the one to the right is an image from Lagos, what is now Nigeria, in 1894. This is an image that was taken of Edward Wilmot Blyden, the gentleman that you see dressed like a European or Victorian figure. Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden, on his second visit to Nigeria during his operations as an advocate of immigrationism of African people outside of the continent to the African continent. There are several luminaries there with him, where he's inaugurating what has become the Shita Bay Mosque, which still exists in Nigeria today. This image here, of course, is a sort of call for proposals of the Pan-African Conference, the first of its kind, that most people argue is the first Pan-African conference in the world, that occurred in 1900 in London under the auspices of the barrister Henry Sylvester Williams. And we can see that in this call, the claim was made that, quote, "This conference is organized by a committee of the African Association for the discussion of the so-called native races question, and will be attended and addressed by those of African descent from all parts of the British Empire, the United States of America, Abyssinia, or what we know as Ethiopia today, Liberia, Haiti, etc." And finally, the red, black, and green flag that was created under the auspices of the largest Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist movement in world history, or contemporary world history, the UNIA under Marcus Garvey, commemorating the blood, race, as well as geopolitical location of African people as having its origins on the African continent. In regards to our learning objectives of having a historical understanding of Pan-Africanism, we'll spend a great deal of time talking about the third and fourth period that emerged as a result of responses to enslavement. But we'll also spend some time complicating our understanding of Pan-Africanism as just not being a modern phenomenon. And so we'll look at Pan-Africanism that emerged 3,000 years before the Common Era and its development during Antiquity up until early modernity. So we'll come back to this slide as well. In regards to thinking about how Africans have thought of themselves, these are just some figures that many of you may have heard of. The gentleman on the left is Denmark Vesey. That is a monument of him in Charleston, South Carolina at Hampton Park that was created or dedicated only about 10 or so years ago. He was the leader of what would have been the largest revolt among enslaved people in American history that was foiled and subsequently resulted in his execution. The gentleman in the middle is Martin Delaney. Many of you have heard of him because he's often attributed with articulating the notion of Africa for the Africans, quote unquote. An early advocate of immigration to Africa as well as nationalism among Africans in the United States. And the gentleman on the right is James Africanus Horton, one of the most significant Pan-Africanists to emerge in West Africa, particularly in Sierra Leone. We'll spend a bit of time talking about figures like these in our lecture. When we think about the range of definitions of Pan-Africanism, I thought this image was a great way to introduce the topic, because here we see an image from 1945 of the Pan-African Congress in 1945. I think I saw someone in the chat. We see an image from the 1945 Pan-African Congress, and to the extreme right, sitting, you may recognize the figure Kwame Nkrumah. I'm just going to check the chat because I haven't. Okay, were there any notable women in the Pan-African movement? Yes, we'll also discuss women as well. One of the reasons I deliberately use these images that focus so heavily on men early on is because Pan-Africanism has a reputation and perhaps a history of being very masculine-centered. The historian Wilson Jeremiah Moses, who's written several books on African nationalism and Pan-Africanism, makes this argument perhaps most forcefully in his book called Afrotopia. And here we can spend some, well, I wanted to use this image to help us think about the debates on the origins and character, because on the right, we see the first leader of a nation in history, known by many people as Menes, M-E-N-E-S, or Aha, A-H-A, the first ruler or Purah of ancient Kemet. And to the right, we see perhaps one of the most iconic images and expressions of Pan-Africanism, where we see seated Kwame Nkrumah with his mentor and collaborator, W.E.B. Du Bois, along with Nkrumah's wife, Fatima, from Egypt, modern-day Egypt. And finally, when we think about the dynamics that shape Pan-Africanism, we certainly have to take into account the ongoing migrations of African people, both forced and voluntary migrations that touch every continent in the world. This is just an image from 1863, helping us understand the international or global dimensions of the dispersal of African people. So in May 2013, the African Union commemorated 50 years since the founding of its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity. And it's interesting the definition that they provided of Pan-Africanism. And this is one that Hakeem Adi includes early on in his textbook that we are taking one of our readings from for today. They argued that, quote, Pan-Africanism is an ideology and a movement that encourages the solidarity of Africans worldwide. It is based on the belief that unity is vital to economic, social, and political progress and aims to uplift and unify people of African descent. The ideology asserts that the fates of all African peoples and countries are intertwined. At its core, Pan-Africanism is a belief that African peoples, both on the continent and in the diaspora, share not merely a common destiny, a common history, but a common destiny. And again, I mentioned that we're taking our first set of readings from Hakeem Adi, a historian based in UK. He's written a very important book called Pan-Africanism, a History. And he begins that text by exploring two critical elements that he contends are central to understanding the history of Pan-Africanism. And those two elements are definition and what is currently being articulated as Black internationalism. So we'll spend time dealing with those two topics, as well as what he refers to as forerunners of Pan-Africanism. He explores the repatriation movement prior to the 1900 by looking at prominent figures, and particularly the centrality of the philosophy of Ethiopianism, before turning to two early expressions of Pan-African meetings or conferences, the first being the Chicago Congress on Africa, and the second being the first Pan-African conference that took place in 1900. So in terms of definition, he makes a very important observation that there's no one universal way of defining Pan-Africanism. But most people tend to agree, or most writers on Pan-Africanism and activists, they tend to agree that it's emerged during the modern period, or as a response to racial capitalism. They express a belief in the unity, common history, and common purpose of the peoples of Africa and the African diaspora. And they place an importance on the liberation and advancements of the African continent itself. He goes on to make the significant claim that the slave trade, which is the largest forced migration in history, and the creation of the African diaspora that accompanied the emergence of global capitalism, European colonial rule, and anti-African racism, are all central to what Pan-Africanist thought and action is connected to, provoked by, and negotiates. He argues there have been two major strands of Pan-Africanism. Of course, the one that emerged during the transatlantic enslavement, which stressed the unity of all African peoples and the conceptualization of the African continent as a homeland, and the more recent anti-colonial African independence movements that emerged after the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester. I'm very textual, by the way, so I tend to rely upon references to text. One of the things that irks me sometimes when I engage Pan-African scholarship, either online or in person, is that it is frequently simply ideological responses, not much evidence. And so you'll have to bear with me, because I was trained as a historian, even as I have committed what scholars refer to as disciplinary suicide, in the sense of not having an allegiance to the methodologies that historians employ typically. And you can learn more about disciplinary suicide and the shift by Afrocentric scholars like myself away from traditional disciplines that are arguably only subtopics of European studies. You can learn about that in the article by Dr. Amamazama that I included in the lesson plan, the article on Afrocentricity by her, that's included also as on the campus webpage. So I won't spend a great deal of time talking about what we call disciplinary suicide, but it's a provocative topic and I encourage you to spend some time dealing with it. I'm trying to go back to my full screen. Does anybody have a clue on how to do that?
So click slideshow.
Click slideshow.
Top in the menu.
Top of the menu.
At the top in the menu. Yeah, right there. No, to your left. Yeah, right there. No, down a bit. To the right.
Here.
To the left. To the right. This is not a new rap song, I promise. Okay, so right there. No.
I think, is this better? Did that work?
There you go.
Okay. I'm still mastering Zoom because I've been thrown into an ecosystem that uses Google Meet. So I've lost track of Zoom. Adi also gives us some very interesting insight about what he refers to as Black internationalism. And this is an idea that's been articulated by the erudite scholar Brent Hayes Edwards, Keisha Blaine, and others. Adi reminds us that in more recent times, it's become fashionable in academic circles, particularly in the US, to use Black internationalism as an alternative to Pan-Africanism. But he makes it clear that there's not any evidence, much evidence, that it was ever widely used by writers or activists in the Pan-African movement. So Pan-Africanism has been and remains the preferred term among most African advocates of Pan-Africanism, both inside of Africa and outside of the continent. So in discussing the forerunners, he argues that before Pan-African and Pan-Africanism fully emerged at the end of the 19th century, there were various efforts of African people in the diaspora, particularly since the 18th century, to articulate a Pan-African vision in order to combat racism, to campaign for an end to kidnapping and trafficking of African peoples, or efforts to actually repatriate African people to the continent. Some examples include ex-slave narrators, such as Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, as well as Alado Equiano. I like the fact that Professor Adi makes it clear that when these writers articulated themselves as being African, or a son of Africa, or a daughter of Africa, this was an early expression, or what he calls an early form of Pan-Africanism. Diallo's writing in 1734, and of course, the abolitionist Equiano, who renamed himself, is writing in 1789. Other examples include the poet Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first Black woman to publish poetry in the United States. In 1770, this is an image of her by an African-American artist by the name of Scipio Moreland. I think it's important to include an interdisciplinary approach to understanding any element of African history. And this is an excellent representation of how African people depicted or saw themselves. Other ex-slave narratives include the more familiar books by people like Ottobah Cugoano, who was writing in the late 18th century. He entitled his book very boldly, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species, humbly submitted to the inhabitants of Great Britain. And he refers to himself as a native of Africa. That is a very radical discursive move. Here's an etching of him that many people believe was him in conversation with people from his own context, depicted as a Black servant here. More information can be found online in newspapers. I think it was The Guardian that published this one, The Unsung Heroes of Abolition. There's also narratives that where people refer to themselves in their contemporaneous reference to Africanity or racial identity. Here we see Britton Hammond referring to himself as a Negro man as a part of his title. This is just a depiction of what the book that he wrote looked like. So ex-slave narratives are very important to understand as a part of early Pan-African expressions. Revolts against enslavement are also important. I think all of us are familiar with Toussaint L'Ouverture. We may not be familiar with the African-American artist Jacob Lawrence, who chose to depict him in regal militaristic fashion as an expression of Pan-Africanism as well in the contemporary moment. This is an image that many people think is Reverend Daniel Coker, who was the first African-American missionary to Sierra Leone, as well as an African repatriate from the United States to West Africa. So when we talk about this issue of early Pan-Africanism, the issue of repatriation inevitably comes up. Repatriation is not only a contemporary phenomenon associated with the year of return in Ghana. I find myself having to remind people of that even today. But there were several early efforts of African people outside of the continent to return to the continent or to move to the continent to reconnect with their ancestry. Adi gives us people like Thomas Peters and Paul Cuff. Some people pronounce it Cuffy. But Peters was notable for leading over 1,000 Black people from Nova Scotia at the end of the conflict between the British and the Americans, who had fought on side, and people who had fought on the side of the British from Canada to establish a new British colony in Sierra Leone, where they agitated for their rights as African people and for African self-government. The entrepreneur and sailor and merchant Paul Cuff is also notable. He used his own ships and part financed the first African-American settlers to Sierra Leone. And he also contemplated assisting people to migrate to Haiti as a safe haven. Martin Delaney, one of the figures mentioned in the title of this lesson, is pictured here when he served as the first African-American officer in the United States Army. But prior to that, this abolitionist writer and medical practitioner had traveled to West Africa and advocated for the regeneration of the African continent, to use his words. He considered other parts of the United States as being viable options early on, but he gradually became convinced during the 19th century that immigration to Africa was the only option. And this is something that he articulated in perhaps his most famous book, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored Peoples of the United States. This was published just prior to the Civil War. Following his travels to West Africa with one of his colleagues, the Civil War that emerged in the United States gave him a change of heart. and he devoted the rest of his life after fighting on behalf of the Union Army to free Africans in the United States from enslavement. He devoted the rest of his life to agitating for what most people refer to as Black nationalism in the United States. He also continued as a medical practitioner and author, writing responses to refute social Darwinism that emerged during his day, in a book called The Principia of Ethnology, or The Origin of Race and Color. Again, many people know him by his statement, Africa for the African race and Black men to rule them. Again, the masculine centered elements of his discourse are obvious. And these are things that I talk about in my book titled Travel in the Pan-African Imagination, that focuses on three male, what I call African Atlantic figures. And I make a case that it's important to analyze them from gendered perspectives to understand some of the biases of early Pan-African expression, but to also deal with them within their own context. Adi makes the important observation that Delaney probably wasn't the first person to use Africa for the Africans. People like Blyden used the term, but he argues that it was common during the 19th century, and it perhaps was an adaptation of the demand of the Irish, of Ireland for the Irish. That image that I included here of Delaney is a very recent image that emerged. Most people have seen Delaney in military attire, but this one I decided to include along with the military attire because it gives a more nuanced approach to understanding him as a human being. And that's one of the things that African-centered scholars do, is that we ask for the African perspectives on any subject that we study. And of course, here an Afrocentric would say, the first thing we notice here is that he's representing himself as an African Victorian, as a gentleman. Even as he is combating racial modernity, he's also a participant in how he chooses to adorn himself, as well as represent himself in perpetuity via photography. Perhaps the most prominent figure, according to many Pan-Africanists from the 19th century at least, is Edward Wilmot Blyden. Edward Wilmot Blyden was a autodidact, was a self-taught scholar. He was a politician, writer, education, and diplomat. He did attend educational institutions early in his life, but one of the remarkable things about Blyden is that even when he was offered opportunities to study at Cambridge and Oxford, he would suggest students of his that should take advantage of those opportunities, and argued that his work was on the ground in Africa. For Blyden, and this is quoting directly Hakeem Adi here, for Blyden, the object of Liberia was the redemption of Africa. Liberia is the first place that Blyden landed as a Pan-Africanist immigrant to the African continent after having been born in the Virgin Islands and having visited several places such as Venezuela and the United States before moving to West Africa. The redemption of Africa for Blyden and the object of Liberia was to elevate the African race. He believed in African redemption that would be brought about by what he regarded as Christian civilization of African American migrants in particular, who would have a transformative role on the continent. So here Blyden, early in his life, when he writes a book like A Vindication of the Negro Race, he is articulating a civilizing mission from an African perspective that gradually becomes critical of that very same civilizing mission as he matures on the continent. He believed that Liberia would lead to the creation of what he called a West African state. and that it was incumbent upon educated West Africans, in his view, that would establish a West African university to train West Africans for self-government and to build West African unity. He was also a collaborationist with the British government, whom he wanted to expand Christian civilization throughout the region. He was of the belief, of course, that the British were not permanent residents on the African continent. So he was appropriating the developmental technologies and materialistic progress of the Western world and wanted to adapt it to an African setting. And he believed that this form of redemption of the African continent could be brought about through colonial rule that would eventually become extinct and would result in independent African states. Finally, I'd like to talk a bit about Blyden's creation of the first Pan-African newspaper in the world. Many people are not familiar with that newspaper that was titled The Negro. He argued that it would serve a race purpose. It was one of the first publications that addressed global Africa. And in this sense, global Africa was seen as the African continent, the Caribbean, and the United States, or what some people call the African world, the Atlantic world, or the African Atlantic world, or as Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic. He popularized his notion of the uniqueness of African people through his theory of the African personality. And he believed that Africans must develop themselves on their own lines through a study of their own culture and languages, as well as an engagement with Islam, which has a very long history in Africa, arguably, especially in West Africa, certainly longer than Christianity, which he articulated in perhaps his magnum opus, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. Some people argue that that arguably is the first scientific academic study of African people from an African author. Blyden had a tremendous influence on people throughout the English-speaking West African territory that was primarily known as British West Africa. This includes people like Casely Hayford from Ghana, as well as people like Majobo Agbebe from Nigeria. And I'm including here an image that I traced down at the British National Archives some years ago when I was doing research for my first book. The first time I visited that facility, it was inaccessible to researchers. And about 10 years later, it was made available to researchers. So I think that my book is the first time that it has appeared in print. This is the masthead, and notice the logo of the newspaper: to create and foster public opinion in Africa and make it racy of the soil. Some other prominent figures include people like Alexander Crummell, and I'm following Hakeem Adi here so that when you actually read the articles, it will be easier to interpret. People like Alexander Crummell, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, and James Africanus Horton. Crummell is perhaps most famous as a mentor to people like W.E.B. Du Bois. He was also an immigrant to Liberia, where he served as a missionary and continued to participate in the Atlantic abolitionist movement. Henry McNeill Turner was one of the most significant leaders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States, as well as in on the African continent, particularly in South Africa. He is probably the first or the most famous advocate of a racial conception of God or the deity from an African perspective, often referring to, in his words, the fact that, quote, God is a Negro. So he was expressing a very racialized Pan-Africanism from a religious perspective. And thirdly, Adi gives us some insight about whom many people refer to as the father of modern African political thought, James Africanus Horton, the physician, scientist, historian, and writer who played a key role in the development of Pan-African institutions in Sierra Leone. All of these figures were advocates of the theory or the ideology of Ethiopianism. And this theory or ideology emerged, especially during the period of the European scramble for African colonies, and it was reflective of the efforts to create African or Black churches in particular. It was a reference, it was expressed through frequent references to biblical texts that mention Africa, particularly the Psalms, verse, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God." This movement is usually conceived as emerging in Southern Africa, where 158 people in Lesotho broke away from French missionaries and formed their own church. African American and Caribbean missionaries also played a significant role in the proliferation of Ethiopianism through their formation of independent churches via denominations such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and Black Baptist churches. Figures that played a key role in articulating Ethiopianism include the creator or the founder of the first African Masonic Lodge, Prince Hall. In one of his famous speeches, he referred to the fact that Egypt was stretching forth her hand from slavery to freedom and equality. Ethiopia was stretching forth her hands. People like Robert Alexander Young wrote an Ethiopianist manifesto, an Ethiopia manifesto, where he spoke of all African people as being descendants or of ancient African civilizations such as Ethiopia. Blyden actually had a chapter in his book, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, entitled "Ethiopia Stretching Out Her Hands Unto God, or Africa's Service to the World." People like the Emperor Menelik, who's most notable for his defeat of the Italians, declared that Ethiopia has need of no one. It stretches its hands unto God. And in South Africa, as elsewhere, we see references in African churches of Africa for the Africans. Ethiopianism in South Africa was strengthened through the protracted conflicts between African indigenous communities and the Dutch Boer and British invasions, which certainly contributed to the sentiments around rebellions at places like Natal or among the Zulu. In addition to church missionizing in West Africa by the AME Church and the AMEZ Church, it's important for us to remember that the people who joined these churches were joining them because they were African organized or African organizations. One of the members who joined the AMEZ Church in what's now Ghana, then the Gold Coast, according to a journalist, argued that it is indeed an entirely Negro church, organized by Negroes for Negroes, man-governed, controlled, supported by Negro energy, intellect, liberality, and contributions. There were people like Mojolo Agbebe, who broke away from American Baptists and played a critical role in forming Native Baptist churches in what's now Nigeria. This was the first independent African church in the British West African colonies. A remarkable thing about him, and what I like about him, is that he was one of those advocates like Blyden who advocated that traditional dress or African dress should become normative. He went a step further than Blyden by changing his name to an African name. He was born David Brown Vincent Agbebe. He advocated the use of traditional dress and traditional culture and music within and outside of church. Often here in contemporary Africa, Sunday, as well as some Fridays, you will see people who appreciate traditional or indigenous dress, culture, and music. But during the rest of the week, when it's not associated with religious worship, they often adorn themselves as people in primarily the Western world, Europe and the United States in particular.
But why would he then keep to the church? Why doesn't he then? Because Africa is rich when it comes to almost everything. So there's also different types of spiritualities that he can choose from. Why would he keep using a very Western system?
That's an excellent question and one that vexes many Pan-Africanists. Now, you have the historians will say, well, he's a product of his time, and that there wasn't a widespread appreciation among the elite, in particular of indigenous African culture. People like Blyden over time began to shift in the direction of advocating for the proliferation of indigenous African culture, most notably in a book called African Life and Customs, where he's very critical of the Christian civilizing mission. And he argues that Islam's presence on the African continent among African people will be temporary. But they don't make that step towards emancipating themselves from the Abrahamic faiths. This is a constant among the vast majority of Pan-Africanists before the first Pan-African conference in 1900. So that remains the question for many of us is, well, here's a figure like Agbebe and a figure like Blyden who are actually operating on the African continent where it would be easy to access indigenous practices and communities, but they still, on the one hand, remain tied to the same group that they regard as a foreign and alien race, but as a mark of their civility, I would argue, as a mark of their being a part of an elite strata, they remain attached to the accoutrements of what they regard as modernity. And modernity in their context is associated particularly with Christianity and the Christian West.
Can
I
I
hope
add
that
can I add a little bit more to that?
yes, please, thank you.
I believe in Blyden's case, he was trained in the clergy, right? He was trained as a priest and a minister, and actually he had some very disparaging views about Africans on the continent before he went to Liberia. And it's by the time I believe he tried to set up a missionary there, actually. And then it was over time when he wrote Life and Customs and he spent time on the continent that he began to change. And you can see the changes in his later texts, where he began syncretizing the Christian faith with the indigenous religions that he learned while he was there. So that says to me is like a matter of exposure and knowledge, because actually he went to Liberia on a Christian mission. I think you're on mute.
Apologies. I froze for a second, but I realized my internet just turned off and turned itself back on.
Yeah.
But I didn't hear your contribution.
Sorry?
It went off right when you were starting your contribution, Nigel.
Yeah,
So,
and I was just explaining how Blyden was trained in, I think, the Catholic faith, and he was a Christian missionary. In the beginning, he went to Liberia to set up a missionary church in Liberia.
Yes.
And it was only then, when he became exposed to indigenous religion, then he began to, I guess, evolve in his appreciation of indigenous religious practice and syncretize that. And that journey is seen in his book. So he wrote Life and Customs, and then he wrote another book. I don't remember the name, but that book, in the first book, he's a little bit disparaging of, the African customs and African worship and religion. But then by the time he gets to his next book, which is 10 years later, he has
Yes.
a different appreciation of what it means for Africans to embrace their own cosmology.
That's absolutely right. And one of the things that I tackle in my book when it deals with Blyden and his gradual shift away from being a missionizing Christian to being an advocate of early forms of what we call Africanism, is that he never fully emancipates himself from Islam and Christianity, even as a critic. There are some of us who've tried to make the argument or were seeking to find out, did he in fact leave the Christian church? He did renounce his ordination as a Presbyterian minister and started to regard himself as a minister of the truth, that he was no longer a Presbyterian minister. And of course, some have tried to make the claim, I think erroneously, that he became a Muslim, even as he was considered a dear friend of the Muslims. But even when he's writing at the end of his life, West Africa and Europe, and when he's writing African life and customs, he's Africanizing or synthesizing or indigenizing his conceptualization of Christianity and Islam in particular, but he doesn't give an indication that, okay, I am now what people would call a traditionalist. I no longer subscribe to those ideologies. However, he always received the accusation that he wasn't a Christian anymore and that he wasn't a believer in the Abrahamic faith. So it's a very vexed story of him late in his life. But you're exactly right to show his evolution from being a bit uncritical of Christianity and being his views being reflective of a very bias against indigenous African cultures, to becoming perhaps the strongest advocate, at least in the literary or academic intellectual world, becoming the strongest defender of indigenous African culture.
Yeah, I think it's like, as an intellectual, it's probably important to contend with the contradictions of many of these early figures, right? Because a lot of them trained and educated in Europe or the West, even though they were proponents of human rights for African people and the liberation of the continent, and Ethiopia in 1935, when there was uproar with Italy invading Abyssinia, they still held very, very warped views about what Africa was about and what Africa was like, And you can see that in a lot of their writing. So there's this dichotomy where they're Africanists in the political, human rights, and civil rights sense, but
Yes.
actually they still hold race ideology that's very problematic. And I think we've just got to contend with that and accept that we all have that journey, right? And the process of, I guess, mental decolonization was as much important for them as it is for us.
But the pro like for me the interesting part of Pan Africanism, and I definitely have a very singular view on it. So yeah, that's unfortunate, I guess. But Pan African to me is trying to understand how that warping works. So this person, he had, and I have it as well, everybody who's been in the West, you've been indoctrinated, you've been programmed, as it were, and you see yourself into from another lens than your ancestors see themselves. And this has been a great shift, and this has been like a schism in why the diaspora couldn't become African, why the Africans thought you guys are crazy, why there was even the possibility of colonizing and neo-colonizing Africa for so long, because they didn't understand, we weren't together anymore. And for me, like Pan-Africanism is really to try and analytically and like clinically understand how that was done, and how it can be undone. So I understand your point that you're saying, like, hey, it's something that everybody goes through, and I get it. I agree. But for me, a big part of Pan-Africanism is to make sure that this can't happen again. And the only way how you can do that is by understanding what the process was, how two Black people who are actually kin see each other as two different things. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say I agree, and it's a great point. But I mean, to go into that, the way kind of the system of global white supremacy works in the construction of consciousness is a huge conversation, right? And I don't know if we're ready for that right now, but it's definitely kind of a pillar we should come back to at some point. 100% agree.
Yes. I'm currently writing a book review on that touches upon this very topic. It's a very important controversial book. It's called W.E.B. Du Bois's Africa. The subtitle is Scrambling for a New Africa. It's by an associate professor by the name of Tahaka Ade, A-D-E. And he gives an Afrocentric approach and deconstruction of Du Bois's notion of Pan-Africa. And one of the claims that he's making is that we not only have to engage the contextual biases of our predecessors, but we also have to shift away from them. And that's the controversy of his book, because of course he's taking on Du Bois and arguing that Du Bois is really a Eurocentric scholar. He's not the first person to argue that, but he's making the argument that Du Bois did not have the cultural apparatus in terms of knowledge production as he did, as far as he and his contemporaries were concerned, to articulate an African-centered or Africological approach to Pan-Africanism. But today, we certainly have it because of the cultural work that has been done since the 1950s and 60s. But again, that's controversial because people like Wilson Moses will say, well, that's presentist, that we are projecting our contemporary views on people from the past. But then today, we still hear people articulating these same views as Blyden and others. So I think there is a lot of room for rejecting their Eurocentric biases. I particularly in my own praxis reject that. But of course, when I present it to an audience, particularly students or scholars, et cetera, I deliberately let them speak for themselves. So I'm very happy that our brother Alexander raised that question, because I was kind of waiting like, wow, I've said civilizing mission, I've said native races, et cetera, and everybody's like, okay, it's kind of quiet. Whereas I was sort of an unruly student, maybe because I started my PhD in my early 20s, right after my tertiary education. So I was always irreverent, and that may have cost me a lot, but so be it. I want to move on with the slides, and because I'm thinking about time here, we only have about 40 minutes. So I will go through these slides a little faster than I like to, but I think that when you review them from the video, you can slow the screen down and you'll be able to get a better appreciation of them. So people like Agbebe, as well as John E. Bruce, were advocates of Ethiopianism. Johnny Bruce is very important because he was one of those people who laid the foundation of establishing a network of Pan-Africanists, very similar to Henry Sylvester Williams. He was an expert at putting people into contact with one another. His contacts included people like Blyden, the founder of the African Times and Orient Review newspaper, Ducey Muhammad Ali, people like Solomon Pladje, people like Casely Hayford. These were all his folks. And what makes it also remarkable is that he played a role in the UNIA, particularly writing for and editing its newspaper, The Negro World. So it's clear that the connections between people like Agbegbe, Blyden, Bruce, and others demonstrates that there were Pan-African networks well before the dawn of the 20th century. And again, I like to include images of them and their attire because it helps us understand many of the conservative elements associated with them. Here we have him. I think that's even a three-piece suit that he's wearing. Black writers who were self-trained, as well as those who were educated scholars, they saw Ethiopia, and more controversially, Ethiopia as the homeland of all African peoples. I included here a reference to the biblical notions of from Psalm 63:31. And I also included a definition that the American historian Nell Irvin Painter, that she includes as a definition of Ethiopianism, an easy way to understand it. She argues that if we think about the ancient African or classical civilizations of Kemet or ancient Egypt, Kush or Meroe, as well as Ethiopia or Abyssinia, that these combined helps us understand what people really meant when they were referring to Black people. So to an Ethiopianist, if you put these three together, that means that we are talking about the Negro race. And this is well before what we call Afrocentricity, well before the 20th century works of people like Sheikh Anta Diop and others. And this is an artistic representation called Ethiopia Awakening by an African-American artist by the name of Meta Warwick Fuller. These images of art mainly taken from Nell Irvin Painter's very important book called Creating Black Americans, a history of African Americans from 1619 to the present. The Chicago Congress, some people argue that this was in fact the first Pan-African Congress that took place in Chicago in 1893. This took place at the World's Columbian Exhibition. People like Frederick Douglass, Henry McNeill Turner, T. Thomas Fortune, Halle Brown, Alexander Walters, these luminaries all converged on Chicago, in fact, to contest what they thought were racist exhibitions of African people and others at this Columbian exhibition. At this exhibition, there was a Dahomey village that was supposedly a representation of what life was like for the so-called natives in Africa. And I just found some images. If you do a Google search of the Columbian exhibition, you can see these very disparaging images of African people who are being staged as if they're in a zoo on display for white people to learn about the other with a capital O. The Congress retained its Eurocentric standards, its Eurocentric notions of, in particular, African people needed civilization and to trade with the outside world. Presentations, of course, were made by distinguished, well-educated Blacks as well as elite and middle-class whites. It was here that Douglass made his opposition to the African-American immigration to Africa movement well known. He had made those arguments before in writing, but even at this conference, he made it clear that he thought that immigration was not the route that African people in the United States should go. But there were people like Henry Bishop McNeill Turner, who we'll talk about briefly soon, who advocated not only immigration, but he made arguments that all human beings have their origins and all civilizations have their origins on the African continent. A similar conference to this Chicago conference was held in Atlanta under the stewardship of what was called the Stewart Missionary Foundation. People like Crummell, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, T. Thomas Fortune, all got together in Atlanta and advocated for for increased missionary activity in saving and civilizing Africa, even as they were critical of the manner of the British treatment of Africans. For instance, Blyden, who did not attend, actually sent a letter praising the British for invading the Ashanti. And of course, he's argues that his is an anti-slavery position and that the Ashanti are principally responsible for trafficking in human beings. But again, the conservative nature is obvious. So when we get to the first Pan-African conference that's organized by Henry Sylvester Williams and his very important group that was formed in 1897, the African Association, we encounter the articulation of Pan-Africanism as a concept for the first time historically. And here, this organization that was co-founded, the African Association was co-founded by a South African woman by the name of Anna Victoria Kinloch. I encourage you to look at the suggested multimedia and the presentation that Adi gave in New York City fairly recently, and he gives us some additional insight that he doesn't include in the book about Anna and Kinloch. And he makes the observation in the book that Henry Sylvester Williams was unabashed about the fact that she played perhaps the largest role in the organization of this African Association, but she's seldom given credit for it. Patrons and supporters of this Pan-African network included a wide range of people like Booker T. Washington, our friend Egbegbe, people like Anna Julia Cooper, who was one of the leading African-American intellectuals of her time. She wrote a very influential book called Voice from the South by a Black woman from the South. And of course, people like W.E.B. Du Bois attended as well. Samuel Coolidge Taylor, the composer, a whole plethora of icons in Pan-African history were in attendance at this meeting that mainly focused on slavery, colonialism, and racism. They saw these as aggressions against Black people that had to be removed. And in their address to the nations of the world at the conclusion of this conference, they condemned racial oppression in the United States as well as throughout Africa, and they made the demand for self-government for colonies. They even sent letters, or what they called a memorial, to Queen Victoria, calling for her attention to how her subjects were being treated. Malefikete Asante, in his very important book called The History of Africa, includes her response. And in short, she only acknowledged receiving the letter and said, "We'll try to do better. I'll be sure to tell my people to treat my native subjects better." But this conference was important because it established or strengthened networks between Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. However, both the Pan-African Association, which it eventually changed its name to, as well as their magazine, were short-lived. But it's important that, according to Adi, that, quote, Williams established the words Pan-African and Pan-Africanism and initiated the modern Pan-African movement at this conference. He consolidated Pan-African networks, in other words, that linked people on the continent as well as in the diaspora. I'll definitely go through the second part of the lecture very fast. And this one is easy to understand because it's more from a theoretical standpoint, even though I have quite a few slides. So I'll first say there's a hand. Yes.
Yeah, mine's just a quick question. So, like, because I mean, this is all quite new to me as well, and I'm still like understanding it. But is it that the conversation of Pan-Africanism was more prominent in North America, Caribbean? But what about the reception of Pan-Africanism on the continent? Like, were there any prominent voices or scholars from the African continent that were speaking, or was it mostly you know, led from North America, Caribbean, and I'm guessing maybe Europe as well.
Very good. Modern Pan-Africanism, or especially Pan-Africanism during the 18th and 19th century, the most significant advocates were either born in the Americas or were immigrants to West Africa. So the early history of Pan-Africanism certainly is reflective of its diasporic background or diasporic emergence. However, we should remember that people like Njola Agbegbe were born and raised on the African continent. People like James Africanus Horden were born and raised on the African continent, but they were a part of a colonially educated strata, missionary education in particular. So even as African based or African-born Pan-Africanists were a part of the early Pan-African movement, their background was not very different from Blyden and others who had received some of their early upbringing or education in the Western world. So the African diaspora figures prominently, and it's in West Africa in particular, Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Lagos colony. You will find African-born figures, but of course the leading lights are certainly those who are from the diaspora. At least that's what the scholarship tells us so far. But I think it's an excellent question to trace some of the students in particular of early Pan-Africanists. People like like Casely Hayford. Casely Hayford is considered the father of Pan-Africanism or Ghanaian nationalism today, and he was African-born, being heavily influenced by people like Blyden, but he went a step further by emphasizing the antiquity of African people, by emphasizing the unity of African people that stems from the classical African civilizations at Ethiopia, Kemet, etc. I hope that begins to answer your question, Kathy.
It does. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Nantambu, with this Pan-African nationalism versus Pan-Africanism from an African-centered perspective, helps us understand that most of what we know about Pan-Africanism and our use of the concept of Pan-Africanism is Eurocentric. He says it's even ahistorical, divisive, as well as dysfunctional. This is an article that appeared in 1998 in the Journal of Black Studies. Instead, he employs what he calls a Pan-African approach. He looks at the Eurocentric orientation of Pan-Africanists like W.E.B. Du Bois, George Plattmore, the scholar Esadike. These are all people that he argues give what he contends are sentimental or emotionally laden and political cultural platitudes. And he includes people like Kwame Nkrumah, Stokely Carmichael, John Henry Clark. He argues that their approach to the subject is fundamentally flawed. We know the Nkrumahs argue that Pan-Africanism is a total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. And people like John Henry Clark help us understand that Pan-Africanism helps us restore what slavery and colonialism took away from African people. Nantambu argues that what they lack is the correct definition of Pan-Africanism or the Pan-African movement because of their short historical perspective. And he even criticizes historians like Ali Masrui and independence leaders like Julius Nyerere, who argue on the one hand that according to Nyerere, Pan-Africanism is a reaction to racialism. Masrui gives us 5 different levels of Pan-Africanism: sub-Saharan, trans-Saharan, transatlantic, Western, hemispheric, and global Pan-Africanism. But according to Nantambu, the Trinidadian historian, by the way, who worked most of his life in the United States, and now I think he is a repatriate to Trinidad, they miss sight of the common denominators. And the common denominators are European slavery, which became European colonialism. And the key point here, foreign aggression into Mother Africa. And these foreign aggressions did not begin in the 15th century with the Portuguese. Rather, he helps us understand that it began much earlier. Before we get into that, and it will even be brief, he helps us understand that Pan-Africanism was not born as a reaction to racialism. It didn't begin in 1900. And those who have such a conception, he argues, are Eurocentric. He uses people like Eric Williams to bolster his point that first we have to understand that slavery itself was an economic institution before it ever had racial overtones. He also helps us understand that if we take that into account, then we realize that nationalists are resisting economic exploitation, not racialism, because slavery is initially based on economics and class struggle. So it wasn't a reaction to racialism in terms of enslaved people, the nationalists resisting their enslavers. He then turns to Walter Rodney, who on the one hand gives us a very good understanding of the fact that slavery was an economic system that was resisted in the Americas. But Rodney too believes that Pan-Africanism was born in the 15th century as a class struggle against enslavement, capitalist exploitation. Nantambu critiques this, however, by making it clear that for thousands of years before the 15th century, African people have been resisting European invasion through efforts to unify. So before the 15th century, people in Africa fought against foreign invaders and conquerors, and he gives us a sort of timeline here that stems from about almost 2,000 years before the Common Era up until the British and Europeans scrambled for Africa in the 1880s. This includes the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Turks, as well as the French. Indeed, African people have fought against European and non-European foreign invaders since antiquity. So the notion that we have to relegate African people's struggles to being only accurate from a European standpoint should be jettisoned. He argues that, in fact, the first national unification on the African continent, the first act of nationalism, is historic. This Pan-Africanist nationalist unification of disparate kingdoms under Narmer, who was renamed Menes by the Greeks, united Upper and Lower Kemet into one nation, with its capital city at Mennefer, or what people later call Memphis. He argues that this, in fact, was an act of what he calls Pan-African nationalism. They did it in order to resist foreign aggression and invasion. So we have to speak in terms of Pan-African nationalism, according to Nantambu, as opposed to just purely Pan-Africanism, which he argues is actually Eurocentric. The fact that Pan-Africanism was born in struggle is true, but the struggle was not against enslavement in the 15th century, but the struggle to unify in the face of foreign invasions at one of the doors to Africa, so to speak, land-based doors around 3,200 years before the Common Era. So here he includes what he calls a conceptual definition of Pan-Africanism. I won't read all of it, but I will read maybe the first sentence or two. Pan-Africanism is the nationalistic, unified struggle, resistance of African peoples against all forms of foreign aggression and invasion in the fight for nationhood and nation building. Its primary goal is the total liberation and unification of all African peoples under African communalism. He then helps us understand that there were actually 4 major periods of Pan-Africanism or Pan-African nationalism. The first period we can trace back to Kemet or ancient Egypt. The second period was the continued resistance of foreign invasions into ancient Egypt, all the way up until the 15th century under the Moors in Spain. The third period, which is where most of us start, the 15th through the 19th century, he argues that this is the emergence of what we would call revolutionary Pan-Africanism because it's characterized by resistance to enslavement. I see your hand, Nigel.
Yeah, just a quick one from me. Like, I struggle to understand how there can be such a thing as African nationalism when Africa isn't a nation. So,
yes. So I think Nantambu has began an important work that scholars like Obadele Kambon and others have helped us add evidence to. And in providing this conceptual definition, he leads the way to linguists in particular, like Obadele Kambon, and I encourage you to watch that short video on the ancient African origins of Pan-Africanism. Kambon and others helps us understand that in indigenous African languages, they have a reference to all African peoples, not Africa, but Black people. So he gives examples in that short lecture of various linguistic groups to help us understand that they have clearly defined terms on what a Black person is and what a Black person is not. And I find myself testing it even in Ghana among different language speakers, indigenous language speakers, because I'll ask them, what's the word for Black? And initially they'll say Obruni, which means somebody from over the horizon. And I'm like, that's not a Black person. How do you identify me as an African or a Black person? And so they tell me what the term is in their language. And I say, can you call a Chinese person or a white British person or etc. by that name? They say, no, it wouldn't make sense. That's not a Black person, right? So Nantambu, of course, the critique, and it's a rightful critique, critical question that you have, how can individuals express what we call Pan-African nationalism conceptually when the term doesn't exist? But I think he is arguing that under ancient Kemet, the conceptualization is it's the land of all Black people, which is literally what Kemet means, the Black nation. They are distinguishing themselves from the Amu, or people that we now call people from Southwest Asia. But that's a beginning of answering that question, and it's something that scholars are still wrestling with. But I want to move a little forward because I hate that we won't be able to do the group discussion. But again, in graduate courses, this is how things usually go. However, I will add the caveat, graduate school was very different from me. We came into a room, we read a book, and the professor would just sit there and ask you, what do you think? And you would just simply say what you think, and they would answer your question, and 2-3 hours, that's all we would do, right? And then you have to do your research paper. But in this era, contemporary graduate education has finally learned that that's not the best approach to teaching. The fourth period after revolutionary nationalism, we see the emergence of what we call intellectual, geopolitical, scientific, and cultural nationalism. Revolutionary Pan-Africanist, intellectual Pan-Africanist, geopolitical, scientific, and cultural. For me, I wish Nantambu had just said that there are different phases of Pan-Africanism, but the Pan-African nationalist sounds a bit strange to me. But again, he was doing very important work in 1998. Here's a timeline to help us understand this first, second, third, and fourth period of Pan-African nationalism, according to Nantambu, from unification to continued resistance to revolutionary resistance and to what we are still dealing with today, intellectual, geopolitical, scientific, and cultural forms of Pan-Africanism. He concludes that he was attempting to decode what he called a Eurocentric analysis of Pan-African liberation, which I think he's successful with. But because he's not a linguist, I would argue that those thorny questions of, well, how are we calling it Pan-Africanism before the name emergence? The people who study pre-20th century nationalism deal with the same questions. How can you call Edward Blyden a Pan-Africanist when he never used the term? So like Adi and others, I think we are best by saying these are early forms of Pan-Africanism. These are early expressions of what we call Pan-Africanism, and that we cannot tell the story of Pan-Africanism if we start with resistance to enslavement. This will only happen if we have a process of what he calls Afrocentrification, or have an Afrocentric or African-centered global re-education, where we have an Africa-centered curriculum when we talk about African people, as opposed to relying purely on Eurocentric analysis. This, according to Namtambu, is the only way we will achieve what he calls a, quote, African ancestral nationalistic timeline, at least when it comes to Pan-Africanism. He finally invokes the significance of Sheikh Anta Diop in understanding any element of Pan-Africanism. I assume that some of you may have heard of Sheikh Anta Diop by now, but he's still one of those figures that many people aren't aware of. So I would encourage you to Google him. There are interviews of him online in both French and English. And of course, the University of Sheikh Anta Diop, the former Sheikh, the University of Dakar, the premier school in Senegal, is named after him. But Namtambu takes a quote from Sheikh Anta Diop's work, The African Origins of Civilization. And this is my last slide. He takes a quote from him to help us understand that just like any subject in Pan-African studies, when we study actual Pan-Africanism, we have to connect it with our classical heritage or with ancient African history. Most of our history has taken place before the 20th century, before modern history. Most African history is ancient history. He helps us understand that we cannot understand any aspect of Black Africa without tracing it back to its classical roots. It would be the same thing, as he said, imagine if a Western historian wanted to write a history of Europe without referring to Greco-Latin antiquity. It's the same thing that happens to Black Africa, which he argues remains suspended in the air and remains unwritten correctly because African historians have not dared to connect it with the history of Egypt or ancient Kemet. So I think that Namtambu, in perfect Afrocentric fashion, does an excellent job of pointing us in the direction of understanding Pan-Africanism from both its modern dimensions, but especially the need for protracted studies of its emergence before the 15th century or before the modern era. Thank you. Now, I don't know if we have time for a breakout session before the assessment, explanation of the assessment. What do you think, Nigel?
I think we should have a 10 minutes group chat. I'm sure there's questions. So maybe if we stay as a group to do 10 minutes and then you close out by the assessment instructions. That's assuming everyone or anyone has questions. I have a lot of questions, but I will give way to our students. Kathy, yes. Anyone else? Okay, perhaps they're still digesting. Go ahead, Kathy.
So what about Garveism? Garveism? Where does that come into the conversation, especially as we're talking about, because that was weirdly, that was my introduction to Pan-Africanism, which was Marcus Garvey and Garveyism. So where does that come into those phases that I think Namtambu was talking about?
Yes, Namtambu. Yes, excellent question. Next week, right? That's when Garvey gets his explanation, because Garvey is arguably an exponent of what we call 20th century Pan-Africanism, even though, of course, he's born in the 19th century. But he comes into this conversation perhaps most clearly when we talk about Blyden, because Garvey, in some of his private papers that have been compiled, makes references to Edward Wilmot Blyden's impact upon him. I think the story goes, and I hope I'm not wrong because it's being recorded, right? I'm not in class on a campus and I can get away with maybe making some errors. But he says that I think he was acquainting himself with Dusi Muhammad Ali. And it was him who recommended to him that you should read Edward Wilmot Blyden. And the story goes that this is when he says he became a Pan-Africanist. Now, there are those who say, well, no, it was Booker T. Washington when he read Up from Slavery. That's what made him into a Pan-Africanist. But Garvey, in his own writings, private writings and some public, makes references to people like Edward Wilmot and Blyden as being one of his progenitors. Garveyism also comes up with people like Johnny Bruce, who were definitely 19th century figures who lived early into the 20th century, but not long. But they played a major role in his newspaper, The Negro World. William Ferris, whom we didn't talk about today, he was a very significant African-American intellectual who wrote a quirky book called The Negro Saxons. Wrote an important book where he used the term Negro Saxon as a way of explaining what he thought African Americans were. And Jenny Praise and Mamadou Diouf do a very good job of talking about them in a book called Global History, where they have a chapter on Ferris and others' efforts to tell a universal history of African people as it relates to the then discourse on civilization. But Garvey, of course, is mainly someone that we associate with the early 1900s and his mobilizing of the UNIA, contrary to situating him as a part of the earlier civilizationist strand of Pan-Africanism, even though Garvey also was an advocate of what we would call the civilizing mission as well.
Yeah, I think that was the point I was making earlier, that, you know, you have these proponents for rights for Africans, but still believed in this civilizing mission. You know, and it's a hard thing to contend with. You know, even in some of Garvey's work, when I read that, it was shocking to see, considering how much we revere him, right? Or Pan-Africanists revere him.
Yes, yes.
Any other questions, guys? Very quiet today. Any thoughts anyone would like to share?
I would just like to I just want to make a comment. My point of interest, because my research is really interested in, you know, how people even, you know, in the diaspora and even in our globalization of, you know, sense of identity, you know, people lose their languages, lose their names. So I want to say it's funny to me, but it's just peculiar that, you know, all these Pan-African figures that we're discussing, most of their names, some of their names are either in English or, so it's, you know, it's already evidence of like displacement, evidence of, yeah, like a loss of sense of self, a loss of tradition. And I think yeah, I think it's something that also needs to be repatriated or, yeah.
Excellent comment. Idibari Zulu, the founding editor of the Journal of Pan-African Studies, has an excellent article on African name usage as being a part of the Pan-African Project as well, contemporary Pan-African Project. But I would like to say that when we think of our early Pan-Africanist progenitors, we have to acknowledge that they are products of the terrorism of enslavement and raciology, as Paul Gilroy would say. They are living in a context in which African people are not considered human beings. So their lineages are reflective of that trauma that comes from forced migration and enslavement, right? And people still live with that today. If we look at most names, especially of Africans in the Western world, their family names are associated with the people who own their relatives. And this is before people started saying, well, this is my Christian name, right? These were forced. So I think that one, it demonstrates that, and I use this example with my students here sometimes when I mention names from the past, it's like that's an example of terrorism. And of course, they only think terrorism is contemporary modern day terrorism. But to be dislocated, as you said, you're using Afrocentric terminology, dislocated, to be taken off one's own terms literally by force is still manifest, even in their efforts to emancipate themselves from oppression, their very names, their very presence. And here I'm talking about comportment. And it's only because I've been adornment, rather, of clothes, because I've been influenced these days by scholars of material culture and what some scholars call the language of dress. These are all dimensions that the contemporary Pan-Africanists, as Alexander even suggested, that we have to interrogate and move and shift away from. But the acknowledgement certainly has to be, well, your name is Fleming because the Fleming people owned the Africans that they forced to take on such a name, which is one of the reasons that I jettisoned it from myself and am going through the transition of a full legal change of it. But that is a project.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. That's a great question and comment.
Well, I don't know how to raise my hand like Catherine is doing here, so I'm just going to interrupt by speaking right away. While we've been going through this, I managed to write down something that I feel, and maybe I can just read it out as my comment. I am appreciating the foundation that has been laid by Pan-Africans as they struggled to articulate the idea of Pan-Africanism. And we can converge and diverge on their opinions as we move towards articulating Pan-Africanism in a way that we are comfortable with. But at the same time, I'm really appreciating my position, like as a person who is pushing Pan-Africanism. We are coming from a point of like a wide knowledge base and exposure and like states of freedom that are can even be unimaginable to these figures that we are discussing right now. So, and also I'm thinking like Africans from motherland Africa need to pick up these conversations much faster and be able to drive Pan-Africanism in a direction that will be, to say, like, you know, well modified and like transferable.
That is great commentary. I hope I see more of it in the assessment because it's beautifully articulated. You remind me of my PhD advisor. He likes to talk about convergences and divergences. Mamadou Diouf, particularly in his discourse on Islam in Africa, and of course Pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Yeah, and later on in the course, we will get to obviously contemporary context, which in the AU is very, very different to what we're discussing now. Yeah, so you're gonna see a trajectory, and I'm guessing be more critical of the conception of Pan-Africanism here on the continent itself. So.
Yes, and one thing I will note regarding the contemporary relevance of even early Pan-Africanists, and because I've spent so much time studying the early variants, I find myself doing my homework on the more contemporary people. But you hear the same discourse. You can notice the civilizing discourse, even as they are not saying this is the civilizing mission, but the developmentalist agenda, for instance, is not very different from the Christian civilizing mission. So many times when I listen to a contemporary Pan-Africanist, I always say, this guy sounds like he's in the 19th, or this woman sounds like she's in the 19th century. But if you don't know that history, then it may not be as from an analytical perspective, easy to detect. But our African leaders who contend their Pan-Africanists even today, they still have this notion that the indigenous community has nothing to offer. They are not cultural nationalists. The cultural grounding is often missing, and they reduce those who are cultural nationalists with just being people who are only into wearing certain costumes or something like that. But it becomes very interesting when you notice that a person like Kwame Nkrumah regards indigenous people as being backwards. If you read his autobiography and the commentary that Ayakwe Arma has given him in his book, Remembering the Dismembered Continent, Ayakwe Arma makes it very clear that whether we're talking about Senghor, whether we're talking about Nkrumah and others, George Padmore, that these are people who certainly don't have an appreciation for African culture. He puts it plain like that and says they don't have an appreciation of African culture because they don't start from the ground. They use Eurocentric theories, and classical Africa, particularly Kemet, is completely disconnected from any of their articulations of Pan-Africanism. So that's why for me, many of the AU discourse are not very different from their predecessors. However, that's just some people say that's the historian talking, right? You guys will notice how everything sounds like something before. Of course, the AU, most of them, they're not saying we want to civilize our communities, but the developmentalist agenda, and I will certainly say the SDGs, are reflective of that in terms of their praxis.
Just to add to that, because I was new to that whole African unity thing when it comes to the framework, and the more that I was reading it, because we had a paper on it last week, and that was the thing that I was like, Jesus Christ, you're trying to copy paste some kind of European democracy that doesn't even work in Europe. You're trying to copy paste it here, and then you don't understand why it doesn't work when you're not even looking at the basis of what are you doing. So from my perspective, I had the same. So it's maybe not only historical perspective, but also, yeah, maybe it's true. Yeah.